Hello. Giving all the technology just a few secs to do its thing, get launched here. And I am going live on both my Instagram platform as well as my Facebook. So I always like to give it a little second in case there's a lag time between the two platforms. So we're just gonna let that happen here for a moment. But it does look like I am live on both Instagram and Facebook. So we're in business. If you happen to join me live today, I would love for you to let me know if you can hear me, if you can see me, where you're logging in from. I'd love you to just say hello. I love when these can be a little bit more interactive if possible, but I also understand that a lot of people end up watching the replay. So never fear if you're hoping to catch the replay. This will be posted after the recording is done. I will make sure that it is uploaded and available for my replay people. So as a quick introduction, while we're letting technology do its thing, my name is Jessie Slutton and I am your postpartum empowerment coach. And I help pregnant parents feel as calm, confident, and prepared for their transition into their parenthood, for their postpartum time frame, as they do for their birth. And I say this so often, but it's so true, and I'm hoping to change this narrative. But as new and expecting parents, we get so excited about the birth and picking out the things on our registry and all the things that are just exciting, centered around the birth time frame, doing our birth planning, all of those things. And we tend to overlook the importance of planning for our postpartum time frame, especially when it comes to our own recovery, our own self-care practices, and one of the big ones, which is what we're covering today, going over boundary setting with our family and friends and really understanding what boundaries we are wanting to put in place for our early postpartum time frame and even for our birth, all of those things, so that we can have a plan. We can ensure we're on the same page with our partner and our birth team and our postpartum support team. And we can communicate that in a way that is really setting up that intention and understanding with our friends and family about why we're setting these boundaries, why they are important to us, and the fact that they're not just mere requests, right? So sometimes when we think we're setting a boundary, we do it in a way that might be a little less firm, and that can lead us to getting a lot of pushback or people trying to walk all over what we thought was a boundary, when really either it was a communication issue on our end where we weren't very clear that this is something that is going to be happening and this is how we are moving forward. This is a part of our parenting philosophy or whatever, our recovery time frame setup, and people aren't understanding that, right? Or it isn't a communication issue and we have a lack of respect of our boundaries. And that's kind of a whole nother level that we might have to address in a different training. But the one I wanted to go over today for the content for today's training is really how to navigate those initial conversations where you can feel confident in the way you are communicating with your family and friends in a way that's going to really show your love and appreciation for the fact that they're excited and they want to be there for you and your baby, and they're excited to meet your new baby, but also really making it very clear that there's a reason you're putting these boundaries in place and that they need to be respected. So we're going to be talking about that today. I'm going to be going over 3 tips. There's a lot of different ways to approach these conversations. There's a lot of different frameworks that I cycle through with my clients and give recommendations on the people that I work with for having difficult conversations, crucial conversations with family and friends and even partners. But today we're going to focus on 3 tips. And if you are interested in getting some more support, not just about the boundary setting and figuring out what those boundaries should be and how you can communicate that with your family and friends, but also how to plan for your postpartum time frame as a whole. Because it is not something that we plan for in, silos. And often I see this in a lot of other programs out there, a lot of DIY, Pinterest stuff, It's very like segmented things. And to be truthful and honest here, postpartum and birth is a holistic thing. It affects every aspect of our life and every aspect of our health. And if we don't approach it from a holistic root source approach, then we oftentimes find ourselves floundering in one area or another once we kind of come onto the other side and we are in our postpartum time frame with our new baby, and we're learning how to parent, and we're learning how to become new versions of ourselves, and how we relate different with our partners and communicate and all of these things. And so really, when we are approaching it from the early beginnings in early pregnancy, and we have a holistic plan, we can feel better prepared for things that might come up when life happens, right? When we have a birth that we did not anticipate, if there is some trauma that is being triggered from childhood trauma that we're carrying with us, that oftentimes can be brought up again during our very vulnerable postpartum and birthing experiences. Having a plan and having the resources and support is key. And so if you're interested in having that type of support and creating your own postpartum empowerment plan, definitely go ahead and set up a clarity call with me today. I put the link to my calendar here on Facebook. You can find it as the pinned link as well as in the first comment. And on Instagram, you can find it in my bio. It is a free call. We'll sit down. We'll just kind of sit down and talk heart to heart, face to face over Zoom, and we'll talk about what your goals are, where you're already feeling a little bit worried or stressed about certain aspects of your postpartum recovery. Maybe you've had a past postpartum experience and you don't want the same thing that happened during that experience to be repeated in this one. And so there's very specific areas you want to focus on. Or maybe you're just looking for some extra guidance and support, whether it comes to your nutrition, your lactation journey, and infant feeding goals, all of those things. That is all covered holistically in my P4 program, as well as in my one-on-one container. So schedule your call so we can sit down and talk about how this program can really support you in a holistic way, and whether or not it would be a good fit for you. But let's dive into today's content about setting boundaries, and really how to navigate these conversations with our family and friends. So there's really 3 tips that I'm going to be covering, and I'm going to kind of go into some more detail around each one of these as we go. So the first tip with navigating these conversations is to start communicating early and openly, and having these conversations in different forms depending on your comfort level with communication. So a lot of times when I'm working with parents, when I find that there's some resistance or some worry or guilt around setting boundaries, verbal communication can be very intimidating for a lot of people. And while I think that that is a skill that is very important that we continuously work on throughout our lives, learning to use our voice, learning to advocate for ourselves, it's very important. But sometimes we just need to get the communication across, and it's important to set the boundaries early and to start having these conversations. And so a lot of times if I have a client who's really nervous about having these discussions, I often will suggest writing an email, some sort of written form of communication about your boundaries or your birthing preferences or requests and visitation boundaries. This often gives you an opportunity to really have the time to put into words what and how you want to communicate with your family and friends about these boundaries and what you are wanting for your early postpartum time frame, and even what you're wanting for your birth. So often, we have a lot of family and friends that are very eager to be a part of the birthing experience, which can be lovely and beautiful. And sometimes this is something that the birthing parent and the partner want. And that's wonderful. If that's what you want, that's great. Sometimes that's not what you want, and you want it to just be an intimate thing between you and your partner and your birthing team. Both of these are great. Neither one of them is better than the other. It just depends on you and your birthing experience that you are looking for and wanting to create for yourself. So when we need to communicate this to our family and friends, that can be where some of these things are really important too, not just for the postpartum time frame, but also for birth. So if you don't want your entire extended family in the hospital delivery room with you, then that needs to be communicated, right? And that needs to be respected. And so having these conversations early and openly, whether that be in written form or verbal, with these people is very, very important. So by having the conversations about these in advance, you really give people enough time to process them and handle their own emotional reaction to these boundaries. And something that is very important that I want you all to keep in mind is that you are not responsible for anybody else's emotions around your boundaries. That is for them to process. We can be empathetic and understanding about why they might have some big emotions and big feelings, whether that's disappointment, anger, frustration. You know, sometimes it'll be fine and people won't have a reaction, and that's great, but sometimes they do. But it's important to keep in mind that that is not within your control. That is something that they need to work through on their own. So don't try to take that on and absorb those emotions and take on that responsibility as your own to make them more comfortable, okay? Because that's not what we're doing here. We are setting a boundary for our own self-care and our own self-respect, and that's an important thing that we need to hold the line on. But I know that that can be very hard. So we're going to talk about how to be firm but empathetic next. But some of the things that you can do with opening or communicating this openly and early is really you can, understand who you want to visit and when and for how long. That can be one thing that you can communicate early on. Maybe you are choosing to have no visitors the first couple of weeks after birth, just to really allow that privacy for bonding, for your healing, for establishing any sort of chest feeding relationship if you are choosing to do so, figuring out how to, balance life with a newborn. This is a whole new person you're bringing into your world, and it's going to take time to adjust to that, right? On top of being exhausted from birth and labor. So often that is something that I do recommend, but again, this is very personal choice. But you want to communicate this early, often, and clearly. So it can be helpful to, if you feel the need to share why, it can be helpful to do that sometimes, but you don't have to feel obligated to do that. If you're setting a boundary, it's a boundary, and sometimes you don't have to explain yourself around that. But if it's something that you feel that you want to do, then you can do that and explain, this is really because we are needing time for rest and recovery and healing. Or I'd really like this time to be private for intimate bonding and just getting to know our new baby and adjusting and settling into this new life together. Or there might be a medical reason. So if your little one, is going to be born prematurely, maybe there's some health complications on their end. Maybe there's some health complications on your end. Being able to communicate that piece can often help people kind of understand the boundaries that you're putting into place. But again, I want to be very clear that it's not something that you have to do where you're explaining yourself. It shouldn't feel like you have to, explain it to death to people to be able to accept that it is a boundary that you're setting for yourself and your family. All right, so that's tip number 1 is open communication early and often, and whether that is in written form or verbal form. So if you need to write a letter, you need to write an email or a text message to really get your thoughts in order and in place and just exactly the way you want to write it, then don't be afraid to do it in that way. And then you can offer to have a discussion later on after you've had a chance to initially send out that information and allow people to sit with that for a while too without having to worry about the initial reaction if that's something that is causing you a lot of stress and anxiety. We need to reduce that in pregnancy, okay? We don't want to add on to more emotional strains. So that's always another really great benefit to communicating in written form. All right, let's move on to being firm but empathetic, okay? So it's important that we are asserting these boundaries firmly and distinguishing them between this is a true boundary that I am setting versus this is just simply a request that I am making. Because if we, again, back to being very clear, if we're not clear about that, then that gives some people a little bit more of a wiggle room to start trying to push those boundaries and really, fight back against that. So the more firm we are, the more clear we are, and the more that we are saying this is a true boundary and not simply just a request. But we can do this in a way that's still very empathetic for how our family and friends might feel about these boundaries that we're putting in place. Again, without owning that responsibility of those emotions, okay? It's very important that we're not taking that on. But it's still okay for us to show some empathy, and it might make communicating it a little bit smoother for you, and be, taken in a little bit easier on the other side without a lot of pushback. So how can we do this, right? And there's really like a very simple framework that you can use. There's a lot of different ways of doing this. A lot of times I'll talk a little bit about nonviolent communication when we talk about offering alternatives for being able to connect with baby and for you during these times where we're setting boundaries. So I'll bring that up here in a minute. But this is just a really simple kind of outline that you can follow. So you want to acknowledge and validate their feelings. Their feelings are very real to them, right? And so it's okay for us to say something like, I understand that you might feel disappointed about not seeing the baby in the first 2 weeks where we're setting this boundary of really allowing time to bond as a family. So you're acknowledging that they are feeling disappointed, or they might be feeling sad, or whatever that feeling is that you think they might, be displaying or may feel if you're doing a written form. And then you can follow that though by holding your boundary still. But we will be having no visitors during the first 2 weeks after birth. And then you can express gratitude, love, or whatever that might be for their understanding and their support of supporting these boundaries. So it could be something like, we really want you to know how much we appreciate your excitement and your love for our new little one and for us. And we are so excited for when, after this 2-week time frame, sticking in that boundary again, has completed, for us to be able to schedule a time for you to meet our baby. Okay? So it's empathizing the feeling, it's setting that boundary again, making it very clear that it's a boundary that you're holding, and then offering or expressing your love, gratitude for their support of and understanding of the boundary, okay? So it's a very simple thing, very easy way to kind of communicate it while still showing, your support or your gratitude and appreciation of their understanding. So then the other thing you can tack on at the end is offering an alternative, right? So I kind of just said that, like, we're looking forward to scheduling some time with you after this 2-week time frame is over. That's one thing that you can do. Where I like to bring in nonviolent communication with some of these conversations, and I do a lot of this work with conversations with partners and support team using this this framework of communicating. But you can also apply it here. So with the nonviolent communication framework, you're really wanting to be very clear about owning your own feelings about something. So if there's a conflict, especially, this can be really helpful because you're saying, you're observing something that's going on by staying neutral about it. Then you are expressing how you feel about that event or that thing that's happening that you are observing or that you're noticing. And then you are going to make a request. Now this is different between the requests that we're talking about for boundary setting, but you're going to make a request of the other person to see how open they are to working with you on something. So that's where this fits in with boundary setting, is you can make a request of them for an alternative to see if they would be open to that, and if and how that would help them kind of still feel connected, involved in the early time frame with the baby, while still being helpful to you and while still maintaining the integrity of that boundary that you have set. So that can kind of look like a really simple thing. Are you willing to? And that's one of the things that I love using because it's easy to remember, and it's a very nice way to kind of make this request. Would you be willing to? And something that you could do is, would you be willing to schedule some FaceTime calls with us during times where we aren't trying to get in our rest, where you can FaceTime with us and get to see the baby while still being in this 2-week time frame, or however long it is. It's going to be different for everybody, or whatever you're wanting to set. That's just an example. Would you be willing to schedule some FaceTime conversations? Another really great one for offering alternative ways is having them feel helpful. This is something that I talk about a lot in the P4 program and with my one-on-one clients when we're talking about creating our postpartum village. Being very clear about who is in your support network and how they can best help you and support you during the postpartum time frame. And this can be a great way to start having these conversations. So something that you could ask if they would be open to doing or helping you with are things like preparing meals. So I understand you're so excited to spend time with the baby when they are here, and we truly appreciate and love all of your support. But we will be limiting the visits for the first 2 weeks. We're limiting visits at the hospital, whatever, insert your boundary. But we would really love if you would help us out in some other really meaningful ways while we're trying to find our way in new parenthood. Would you be willing, would you be open to, that's another way to frame it, helping prepare some meals for us, especially for those first couple of weeks, that we could maybe put in the freezer so we could pull them out when we get home from the hospital, and it's so easy for us to make sure we're staying nourished. Would you be willing to do that? So that's a very specific way that you're asking somebody to help you. If they choose, and oftentimes people love to be able to be helpful, right? They just need to know how to be helpful. And this is where we can communicate these things, where we're offering an alternative to a boundary that we've put into place while still acknowledging the fact that they're excited, we're acknowledging their feelings, and being empathetic toward that piece. So that's a really easy way to ask if they would like to help in different ways that is still allowing you to have that very clear boundary. Let me check my notes here, make sure I didn't miss anything. So I have a whole slew of ideas on how and what you need from your support village in postpartum and how to prepare for that ahead of time in the P4 program. So this is a whole section we work through. I have 5 pillars in my postpartum empowerment plan that we work through. And one of them is, figuring out who your people are, who is going to be in your village. A lot of times when I ask this question, many people say, I don't have support. And it can feel that way. It really can feel that way. In some very rare cases, this is true. I mean, you may be completely isolated from any sort of support, but often if we kind of break through some of that resistance in thinking that we don't have anybody at all, and we really sit down and we can work together on this brainstorming of who's in your network currently and how can they help you in maybe some more creative ways, often we find that we actually do have more than we think, and we just have to break through some of that uncomfortableness of getting of being okay with needing and asking for help. So that's a whole nother thing that we can talk about, but it does apply to this particular training, and that we are setting boundaries with family and friends and support people. But the thing I wanted to mention there is that, during the P4 program, we sit down and we talk about who the people are, and then we talk about how they can support. And we talk about all the different ways that you're going to be needing support. And so we make a whole list about some of these offering alternatives and compromises on how they can still be involved while still holding your boundary. So again, just another benefit for enrolling in that program and getting really prepared ahead of time for your transition into parenthood. It's a huge life-altering change. I mean, it's one of the biggest changes in our lives that we could ever experience is becoming a parent. And I always say birth is just the beginning. So it's time that we start focusing on more than just the one day, the birth, the couple of days when we're in labor, right? Our laboring process. And moving our focus and our planning energy beyond that little singular event into what really morphs and shapes the rest of our lives, right? So let's just do a quick recap here. I was getting a little bit of my ADHD brain going on at the end where I was like kind of getting excited about sharing about my program. So I want to be really clear about what we covered today specifically, and that was navigating these conversations. I gave a few tips on how you can do that, whether it's verbal or written. We talked about the 3 major ways of really giving you confidence and guiding you through these conversations, and that's communicating openly and early and very clearly with these family and friends, being firm yet empathetic, and I gave you some tips on how to frame these conversations so that you are still being empathetic and acknowledging that this might be difficult for somebody without owning that emotion, right? And then offering alternatives on how they can still support you, still feel connected with the baby, but still holding your boundary. And so those were the 3 things we went over today. There is so much more that goes into boundary setting. There's a lot of stuff that you might even have to work through with, past trauma and all of this stuff that can be very much an influence on how we are comfortable or uncomfortable with setting boundaries, right? But this will kind of give you a place to start. And I really want to encourage you to schedule some time with me to talk about the P4 program and working together. Because understanding the importance of boundaries, knowing kind of how to set them and how to have these conversations is a really important starting point. But actually figuring out how to navigate these conversations in a very specific way to your circumstances and with your relationships that you have in your life, and figuring out how to navigate pushback, because sometimes there is going to be conflict that might come up, and having to go through that and navigate that alone can be really, really isolating, and it can feel really yucky and add a lot of stress into your life. And so that's another benefit of working with me, is having somebody who is going to be your sounding board, who will be there to just validate your feelings and emotions, who will be there to champion your choices and to really help you brainstorm on how to deal with all the bullshit that might come up and really try to bring more peace to your planning time frame and inevitably set you up for a more empowering postpartum. So that's all I have for you all today. I hope that this was helpful. I would love to hear how you felt about it, any takeaways you might have had about it, or how these conversations are going for you if you've had them. I'm always very interested in hearing from you all about that. Otherwise, please go ahead and schedule your clarity call with me. If you don't see a time that works for you, DM me. We will figure it out. I have a flexible schedule where sometimes I can really move things around to figure out meeting with you during a time that would work. So I am excited to see you all on my calendar, and we will see you next week for the next training. I'm not quite sure what the topic will be, but it'll be good. So we will see you then. Bye.